Summarized story of the prophet's call. This story of the prophet Nehemiah's call begins with him living far from his homeland as a Jewish man serving in a foreign land. One day, a group of men arrived from Judah and shared troubling news. The walls of Jerusalem were destroyed, and its gates had been burned down. This report deeply affected Nehemiah, leading him to pray earnestly and seek God's guidance. After praying, he asked God to help him speak to the king about the situation. Through this moment of reflection and faith, Nehemiah realized that God was calling him to lead the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. His mission was not only to restore the physical strength of the city, but also to uplift the hope and spirit of the people who live there.
One of the most significant events that happened during Nehemiah's time was the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. When Nehemiah heard that Jerusalem's walls were still in ruins right after the Babylonian exile, he was deeply grieved. So, with the king's permission, he returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the city's fortification. So, despite the oppositions from enemies like Sanballat and Tobiah, as well as the discouragement of his own people, Nehemiah led the rebuilding with pure determination and faith. So he was able to rebuild the walls rather, in just 52 days because of his leadership.
So right now we'll be talking about the situation of the Israelites during the time of Prophet Nehemiah. So first thing first, during the time of Prophet Nehemiah, the Israelites at that time were a small, struggling community, and they were trying to rebuild their national and religious life after returning from the Babylonian exile. And actually, they at that time they were having a political and social condition. It's more like they live under a Persian rule, and also not as an and they live under the Persian rule, not as an independent but somewhat kind of a dependent nation. And Jerusalem at that time had no walls, leaving the people defenseless and vulnerable to the enemies. And also, the population at the time was small and weak, and many houses were still in ruins. And also, the Israelites at the time of Prophet Nehemiah, they were having a somewhat kind of economic hardship. It's more like many Israelites at the time were extremely poor because of famine, taxes, and some were forced to mortgage their fields and vineyards, borrow money at high interest, and also it would came up to the point that they would sell their children into slavery in order to repay their debts. So at the time, wealthy Jews were exploiting their own people until Nehemiah confronted them. So actually, Prophet Nehemiah has a great role in rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And also they do had a kind what we call this religious and moral problems. It's more like the people or the spiritual life of the people had weakened, and the common issue at the time were somewhat kind of intermarriage with foreigners, which led to neglect of Jewish identity, and you know, and also the Sabbath violations. It's more like Sabbath violations because merchants continued selling goods on Sabbath, and neglect of the temple. Priests and Levites were not receiving support. And the last one is the external opposition. So actually, the Israelites at the time faced strong resistance from surrounding groups. And to sum up everything, the Israelites during the time of Prophet Nehemiah, they were having actually Israelites, they were somewhat kind of a small community who who is trying to rebuild their city identity and faith, and with that they face such political weakness, economic injustices, and others. And through the aid of Prophet Nehemiah, the Israelites itself were able to regain their somewhat kind of their system, their faith, and their culture. So that would be all, and thank you.
This is the discussion of the mission and message of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's mission began with a crisis. Jerusalem's walls were destroyed, leaving the city exposed and its people discouraged. When Nehemiah learned of this, he recognized that the broken walls were not just a physical problem. They symbolized broken identity, broken security, and broken community. His first mission then was a practical and visible, to rebuild the walls and restore strength and dignity to God's people. But Nehemiah did more than organize construction. His message called the people to unity, responsibility, and faith-driven action. Rebuilding the wall became a shared effort, reminding the community that renewal happens when people work together with purpose. However, the physical walls were completed, Nehemiah saw a deeper issue. The community's spiritual life was weakened. Injustice, neglect of God's law, and harmful influences were eroding their relationship with God. So his mission expanded. He confronted exploitation, reminded the people of Sabbath, and urged them to return to their covenant with God. Nehemiah's message was clear. True restoration is both external and internal. A secure city means a little without faithful and just community. His message was ultimately about rebuilding lives, values, devotion, and not just stone walls. Through leadership, prayer, and reform, Nehemiah guided the people towards a renewed just identity rooted in the obedience, justice, and faith.
Israel's response to Prophet Nehemiah's message was one of deep repentance, unity, and renewed faith in God. When Nehemiah came to Jerusalem and encouraged the people to rebuild the city's broken walls, they listened to his message with open hearts and willingly took action. Despite facing strong opposition and threats from surrounding enemies, the people worked together with determination and courage, believing that God was guiding and protecting them. Once the walls were completed, the Israelites gathered as one community to listen to the reading of the law of Moses. And upon hearing it, they were moved to tears, realizing how much they had strayed from God's commandments. This led them to confess their sins, fast, and pray for forgiveness, showing sincere desire to return to God. They also renewed their covenant with Him, promising to obey His laws, keep the Sabbath holy, and avoid unfaithful practices that had caused their downfall before. Their response reflected not just physical rebuilding, but also a powerful spiritual renewal, as they restored their faith, strengthened their identity as God's people, and committed themselves once again to live according.
The effects of the Israelites' response to the prophet's message. Quickly reconstructed Jerusalem's walls in just 52 days despite opposition, restored the city's dignity and security, marking a pivotal moment of communal strength. A spiritual revival followed, led by Ezra's public reading of the law, which stirred deep repentance and led to the celebration of the Feast of Booths. Expelling intruders, restoring temple support, enforcing Sabbath day observance, and purifying the community through separation from public marriages.